Ambiguous pronouns and names, tracking participants in biblical passages using referent analysis. Hi, my name is Rick Brannan. I'm a part-time contractor for Biblica, working on the CLEAR team and focused on linguistic annotations of the Hebrew Bible and Greek New Testament. In this presentation, we'll be looking at techniques of referring expressions within the Greek New Testament, and how Biblica is annotating these for use in the Bible translation workflow and other applications. Ambiguous reference is a problem. And it isn't a problem because there are impossible to resolve contexts in either the Hebrew Bible or the Greek New Testament. It's a problem because it is yet one more thing consultants and translators need to pay attention to in the translation process. Pronouns are easy to translate. They're just he, she, they, or it. But one must also ensure they have properly tracked participants or the referring structures in the target language to accurately render the source text. Clear Bible, now a part of Biblica, have been working on analyses of the Hebrew Bible and Greek New Testament. As part of this effort, Biblica's Clear team has done work to begin to address this problem. These analyses are part of the analyzed corpora of the Hebrew Bible and Greek New Testament called macula. So what is macula? Macula is an acronym that stands for Machine Assisted Corpus Unified Linguistic Annotation. Macula is a set of data encoded using XML that provides a syntactic analysis of the Hebrew Bible and the Greek New Testament. But why macula? Because it also includes a lexical analysis and a morphological analysis. It provides rudimentary semantic frame analysis. It categorizes words semantically using the systems prescribed in the Semantic Dictionary of Biblical Hebrew and Semantic Dictionary of Biblical Greek from the United Bible Societies. Most important, however, for our context, it provides a basic analysis of pronominal and subject reference in the Hebrew Bible and the Greek New Testament. But also pretty important for our context is supporting translators, consultants, and translation organizations around the world. So the goal of macula is to provide freely reusable data sets to better understand the source language texts, the Hebrew Bible and the Greek New Testament. Okay, so what is this referent data? Macula uses two different strategies in annotating the source data. The first method is pronominal reference. Each pronoun in the source language is annotated with the corpus level identifier of the textual item that serves as its referent. The second method are subject reference. Each verb without an explicit subject in the source language is annotated with the corpus level identifier of the item that serves as its referent. What this means is pronouns and verbs without explicit subject each carry a specific annotation that points back to its, for pronouns, antecedent, or for verbs, its implied subject. This is really cool and it's really important. So let's talk about pronominal reference. For examples today, we'll just use the Greek New Testament, which is the SBL Greek New Testament. Luke 4 verse 5 provides an example of pronominal reference. The bold red items are pronouns in Greek and English. We're in Luke chapter 4, the Lucan version of the story about Jesus being tempted by the devil. In Luke 4 verse 5, the devil has just led Jesus up some high point or vista and showed him all the kingdoms of the world. Now here's where I insert my disclaimer about Greek pronunciation. It's not going to make anybody happy, but it is what it is. In the phrase leading him up, the Greek verb anagagon is translated leading up, and the pronoun avton is translated him. We'll skip the verbal phrase he showed for now, and then move on to the phrase to him all the kingdoms in the world. Here the Greek pronoun avto is translated by to him. The question here is, who is him and who does to him refer to? Now we can see the Greek of a larger slice of the passage from Luke chapter 4, verses 1 through 5. Our primary interest is in verses 4 and 5. Below the Greek is an element from Macula XML that represents the specific single word, the third word of verse 5, the pronoun afton, which is the first read word in verse 5. Within the XML, notice two items in bold red. One is the word itself, afton, and the other is the ref attribute that encodes the corpus level identifier of the pronoun's antecedent. The ref attribute points to the circled text, ha Jesus, or really split Jesus, Jesus, that it encodes. In this way, there's a positive, unambiguous link between the pronoun and its antecedent. This model is followed for the whole of the Hebrew Bible and the Greek New Testament. Now let's look at subject reference, back in Luke 4, verse 5 again. Subject reference are encoded on verbs in clauses that have no explicit subject. In this verse, there is a participial clause that uses the verb anagagon, and the main clause that uses the verb edeixen. Neither clause has an explicit subject marked. So in the Macula data, each includes a subject referent attribute, subref, pointing to the implied subject of the clause. Let's look at it. Here again, we have the Greek text of chapter 4, verses 1 through 5. The XML at the bottom of the screen reflects data for the main verb of the clause, edeixen, which is in red on the last line. As with pronominal reference, an attribute, here subref, encodes the identifier of the word that serves as antecedent reference. The identifier points to diabolos, devil, in verse 3, making its linkage unambiguous. The word data for anagagon points to the same identifier. But how is this useful? I freely admit that this is a lot of data and is not directly useful. For it to be useful, one must know at least a bit about the Greek and the New Testament, and one must know some things about XML, and one probably needs to know how to write some code to evaluate and process the data. I've used Python here. And there aren't scads of people with that set of skills. And I'm guessing that most of the people that would find this sort of data useful do not have that set of skills. So how can this data become accessible and useful? We need alignments to source texts, of source texts to translations. We need them at the word level, because then we can create views for this data, rooted in the source languages, that responsibly bubble data up to a translation. And this is how non-specialists and adjacent specialists, like translation consultants, can start to use this data. Now, the next slide has a look at the Lexham English Bible, used here because it's got a relatively permissive license, with reference added in based on the pronominal and subject referent data, and a word-level textual alignment between the Lexham English Bible and the SBL GET. So this is Luke 4, verse 5 in the Lexham English Bible. I've used an alignment of the LEB to the Greek New Testament to annotate words with information about their reference, type of referent, word class of antecedent, Lunida annotation, or the SDBG Semantic Dictionary of Biblical Greek annotation, and a gloss. So we see that led up translates the participle, which was anagagon, and him translates the accusative pronoun. You can tell by the SUBJ inside of the purple annotation and the PRON inside of the kind of pinkish annotation. So the underlying data helps us understand who was leading the devil, diabolos, and who was being led, Jesus. These pronominal and subject referent items are annotated throughout the Hebrew Bible and Greek New Testament. We're using Lunida annotations, like I said, as a first step in identifying and unifying the identifiers for these items. So with an aligned translation like you've got here, the English is aligned with the underlying Greek. Seemingly complicated things start to become possible, like this. Here's the same verse, but in Chinese. It's actually Luke 4, verse 5 through 6, based on how the Chinese text translates the material. Because the translated text is aligned to the underlying Greek New Testament, and because the pronominal and subject referent analyses are done on the source languages, information annotated on the source languages can bubble up through a textual alignment to a translation. As these textual alignments become more and more integrated in the translation process, useful and important information sourced in the original source languages can bubble up that ladder into the translation as well. If alignments in other languages were available, different versions of this data could be generated. It would be as simple as swapping out the alignment. The philosophy: annotate the source languages once, propagate the annotations to translations through alignments as much as possible. Let's look at another example. Here we have Matthew 8, 14 through 15. The context here is when Jesus and his disciples came to Capernaum. They went to Peter's house and found Peter's mother-in-law very sick. The first question on the screen is due to the Lexham English Bible's translation, where he saw his mother-in-law. So whose mother-in-law? The Referent annotation makes clear that it was Peter's mother-in-law, and this is clear in the Greek as well, but it can get muddled in translation, like here in the Lexham English Bible. This might be a place to use Peter's name instead of the pronoun, like, and when Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying down and suffering with a fever. That would remove the ambiguity, and that's the sort of task that translators do all the time. They need to know when to sort of reassert the participant, when to reactivate them in order to make everything coherent. So here's another view of the same thing. Looking at the English, we can see that he saw has no subject referent encoded, right? So it looks like maybe something should be encoded there, because shouldn't there be something for he? But in reality, the data is being propagated from the Greek to the translation just fine. The issue here is that the verb he saw, Eden, has an explicit subject earlier in the verse, which this view shows you, Jesus, Jesus. So there's no implicit subject to encode with the verb. The English just reinstantiates the participant with a pronoun. So this is a little problem, and we're considering ways to encode data like this in this framework to ensure that each verb encodes a referent to its subject, whether the subject is present or implied. This is really important because it shows that participants are instantiated and referred to in different ways across different languages. What works in Greek does not directly match with what works well in English. And this is why, at least for the English translation, he may be added in situations like this to reinstantiate the reference, or the participant's name may be used as a clarification or disambiguation when the source only uses a pronoun. Let's look at another example. This is Acts 18, verses 19 through 21. The context is Paul and his crew arrive in Ephesus. Paul goes into the synagogue, and after being in Ephesus for a bit, they move on. This is a really interesting example because it is essentially a small paragraph recording a single episode of Paul and his company's arrival, stay, and departure from Ephesus. And yet within the short episode, there are no explicit references beyond the Jews in verse 19 and God in verse 21. One needs to track reference in order to make sense of who is doing what and when they are doing it. This display of the subject reference and pronominal reference allow this to happen with less friction than working it all out on one's own. It's not that resolving reference is an impossible task, but it's a task that must be done, implicitly or explicitly, in every clause of every verse of a translation. Providing the information when needed is one way to speed up the translation process, ensuring the necessary information is at hand when a problem is encountered. Let's look at this a little bit differently. Other translations handle the participants in this passage differently. The last translation was the Lexham English Bible. Here, the NIV explicitly reinstantiates Paul, Priscilla, and Aquila because the plural referent is a bit ambiguous. The referent analysis, however, which is here plotted on the NIV, on the Lexham English Bible, uses both pronominal reference and subject reference to make this information explicit. This allows the information to be available for translators and consultants to use in whatever manner is proper for the target language they're working with. So here you can see how he and Paul are represented inside of the image. and why the NIV chooses to separate and mention all three of them, Paul and Priscilla, because there's a separation, and he's making clear, that translation tries to make clear who left and who stayed. Let's look at another example. Here we are in 1 Corinthians 13, 4-8. This example of a well-known passage is interesting because it shows that reference need not be people or even physical objects, but can also be concepts. Subject or pronominal reference can be pretty much anything. At the start of verse 4, we read, love is patient, love is kind. And here, love is the explicit subject of both clauses. So they are not directly annotated. That's why there's no bubbles around or around the verb. As mentioned in the previous slide, we're thinking of the correct way to incorporate this sort of data representing the situation into the subject referent data. So from this point, love is the subject referent of every verb through verse 7. In verse 8, love becomes an explicit subject again with love never ends, and then a pattern where the object of a clause becomes the implied subject of the following clause. The referent data in Macula tracks all of this, meaning the translator or consultant can consult and confirm in their translation process. Referents really are everywhere. So how is this data distributed? As mentioned earlier, one of the purposes of Macula project is to provide freely reusable data sets to better understand the source language texts. To that end, Macula data is available on GitHub, and anyone can download the XML. Here are the locations where it's available. You can go there right now and download most of the stuff. Note that the SBL-GNT isn't quite ready yet, but we anticipate it should be ready by the time of the Bible Translation Conference in October. We also have some alignment data available on GitHub. That's where I got the data to align the Lexham English Bible and the Chinese edition. And again, these are public repos or downloadable today. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being interested in this presentation. And if you have any questions, I'm available. Thank you.